Minutes from our last meeting. As we continue to meet over the next couple of months, I would like for each of you to begin thinking about policy and/or legislative recommendations from myself and my colleagues in order to support the great work that we have learned from all of our presenters. At the last two meetings, we focused on policies and protocols at our local colleges and universities. Today we'll be hearing first from the Colonel of the Rhode Island State Police, as well as the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office. In addition, we'll be hearing from one more college, Dr. Campbell of Providence College. But before we get started, do any of the commission members have any questions? Okay, then, we will get started. I'd like to call up our first presenter, and that would be Colonel Stephen O'Donnell from the Rhode Island State Police. Would you please come up and present? Go down. Right down there. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Sergeant Lori Ludovici, who represented me during most of this commission, and her tireless work for the State Police and representing us here professionally. So again, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to address this poignant topic. Many college women say their experiences after being sexually assaulted illustrates a culture of indifference and denial that results in 1 in 5 young women being assaulted during their college years. After an attempted or completed sexual assault, victims are 4 times more likely than average persons to contemplate taking their own lives, showing just how harmful and life-altering this crime is on all its victims. Sexual assaults cross all barriers, genders included. Same-gender assaults are not uncommon on college campuses. Experts say, but the obstacles to reporting are even greater. In 2010, 18.1% of crimes reported on college and university campuses were sexual assaults. Of both attempted and completed sexual assaults on college campuses, only 5% were actually reported. Some students feel the act is not serious enough. They're embarrassed or ashamed. The reporting process is too difficult, or they feel nothing will be done. These empower perpetrators and could increase the incidences of sexual assaults on our campuses. In 1990, President Bush signed the Campus Security Act to address these problems. Congress amended the law to expand and strengthen its provisions in the Jean Cleary Act. It took effect on October 1st, 1998. The act requires colleges and universities that receive federal funding to share information about crime on their campus, improve campus safety, and inform the public about crime in and around the campus. This information is made accessible to the public through its annual security report. Under Title IX, institutions must also provide specific information, options, and resources to survivors, and have a prompt, equitable process for receiving and reviewing complaints. The penalties for institutions not complying with these requirements are fines up to $35,000 for each violation, and possible loss of federal funding. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act also imposes obligations on institutions under its Campus Sexual Violence Act. One of the requirements is to adopt certain institutional policies to address and prevent campus sexual violence, such as training for campus personnel. The Rhode Island General Assembly has also enacted laws to protect victims and hold offenders accountable. Proof that the victim resisted is not necessary if the victim reasonably believes that resistance would be useless and might result in serious bodily injury. They have also passed legislation regarding admissibility of certain evidence, obtaining sexual assault, protective orders, and penalties for violation of these orders, and duty to report by a witness and penalties for not doing so. These are the tools that law enforcement need to conduct a thorough investigation so that our Attorney General's office can prosecute and the courts can hold those offenders accountable for their actions. The Rhode Island State Police, as you know, has statewide jurisdiction set out in General Laws 42-28. As a result, we are in a unique position to provide assistance on any type of investigation to any college and university throughout the state of Rhode Island. The expertise of the members of the Rhode Island State Police are called upon during the annual Rhode Island College, University, and Public Safety Academy, known as RICUPS. The Academy falls under the jurisdiction of the Rhode Island Municipal Police Training Academy, which is one of the agencies that fall under the Department of Public Safety, which I oversee. Many retired state troopers and retired police officers from different police departments within Rhode Island are security directors at various colleges and universities throughout Rhode Island, and certainly have a stake in understanding of the complexities of this issue and are well versed on sexual assault response. Municipal police officers teach at the RICUPS Academy in their areas of expertise, so that new college public safety officers will be better able to participate in crime prevention and be effective first responders to all crimes on their campuses, including sexual assaults. Sensitivity training to those same officers is critical as we continue through this process. Our detectives and local detectives investigate and process crime scenes. On college campuses, it should be no different. Typically on a college campus, the crime scene is not as preserved as it typically is when you're talking about a sexual assault on the street. We also have a victim service program, as all the local police do, and the college and universities share with victim advocates, some of them represented here today, how they can respond to the scene and ensure that the victim's needs are taken care of, so detectives conduct their investigations. I have to explain to you, and it's critical. It's a critical piece of what we do for the victim advocates to sit down and talk. They bridge more gaps than you can possibly imagine talking to law enforcement, because some victims feel that law enforcement's part of the problem. What I mean by that is their fear of talking to us. Either they don't think it'd get done, or a female talking to a male, or even a male talking to male because of the relationship between law enforcement and the community, or lack thereof. Again, this is a critical piece of the justice system, and I commend those who do this. The proper procedure governing mutual aid, interagency relationships, criminal investigations, collection and preservation of evidence is critical. And victim, witness assistance are all outlined in Rhode Island State Police General Policies and Orders. The Rhode Island State Police is a nationally accredited organization on the Commission of Law Enforcement and Enforcement Agencies and statewide by the Rhode Island Police Accreditation Commission. The general orders have been promulgated to meet the standards required of both CALEA and RIPAC. The Rhode Island State Police is generally not called upon by college and university campuses to be a first responder to a sexual assault. The common practice is that police departments, where the college is located, is called upon and to assist. Some of the colleges that are certified by the Police Officers Commission on Standards and Training, referred to as the POST, for example, the University of Rhode Island Police Department and the Brown University Police, will investigate sexual assaults and may ask for assistance from local departments or the state police. They have their own jurisdictions over these type of crimes. Over the past few years, our State Police Major Crimes Unit has been called in on several state college sexual assaults investigations. That being said, the State Police is called upon to speak to students at colleges and universities on awareness and prevention of sexual assault frequently. I've spoken at Brown University, Bryant University, Roger Williams, Rhode Island College, Salve, Regina, about sexual assaults. Typically, it's with male athletes, making an effort to get to the male athletes to talk about them. What I found very crystal clear is talking to students and student athletes about pointing that person out. That's the person preying on is your sister. When you ask many of the student athletes how many have sisters, they raise their hand. And how would you like that guy next to you preying on your sister? So whatever it is, education-wise, it's really important that we get to them. And I think more law enforcement should take that time to get into these colleges and universities to talk to them and to empower the victims to step forward. Last October, I sat on a panel at Roger Williams University. They showed a documentary film called The Hunting Ground. I don't know if anybody has seen that. Very, very powerful and moving discussion followed this film. The film focuses on students, both male and female, who allege that they were sexually assaulted at their college campuses, who then faced the second victimization when they tried to bring the allegations to school administrators. The filmmakers contended that most rapes are committed by a small number of repeat offenders who become emboldened, empowered by not being caught, and are able to continue to commit these types of crimes. The film was moving, powerful, and showed the pain, hurt, frustration, and lack of empathy from school officials that the victims experienced. Even if the school officials said that they had empathy, the victims said they didn't feel like they got that, and that is telling in itself. The several requirements of the Clery Act, including the annual report, brings crime on our state's campuses out of the dark, out of the shadows. Anyone can now find out how safe their campuses really are. I went on the Roger Williams website, downloaded the annual report, was able to easily find out that in 2012 there were 6 rapes. 2013 there were 14. 2014 there were 5. You can easily find out this information about any college that is required of the Clery Act in that same annual report. There's a clear need for training and awareness in order to bring all allegations forward for a thorough vetting by law enforcement professionals to ensure that our system of justice works for the victims and the alleged offender. The Rhode Island State Police has expertise to respond or assist and will continue to speak to student athletes throughout the state about awareness and prevention of sexual assault. We'll also continue to drive training through the Rhode Island State Police Training Academy, the Rhode Island Municipal Police Training Academy, and the Rhode Island College, University, and Public Safety Academies. In closing, sexual assaults on college campuses is one way of referring to this. But we only have to look to a local boarding school in this state that made national news recently with allegations of sexual assaults over decades to know that is a real problem with real victims that need real solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel O'Donnell. That was very enlightening. I would like to know if the committee has any questions for the Colonel. Yes, Ms. Johnson?
I do. First of all, I want to acknowledge you and thank you on behalf of the victims that of the fine work that our advocates do with sexual assault victims. I think it's really important that law enforcement be constantly aware of this trauma that sexual assault survivors have just gone through. It's so important that you listen to them and that you understand where they are at that time especially. So, thank you.
Anybody else? So, Colonel, what more do you think can be done, maybe from the state police point of view?
I think police in general, training. As I discussed earlier with Chief Desmarais, you have oversight over training academies, and I think the overwhelming need for training in every aspect of sexual assault, human trafficking, they're all kind of intertwined together, and sensitivity training. I think Jane sent it right that as a cop, police officer, however you refer to us, that policeman, patrolman has to know, and it's impossible to know what that victim's going through unless you've been through it, but you have to be sensitive to listen and to let that story come out. And I say this candidly, we have some superstars within our divisions that do this. One of our detectives, Heather Donahue, a female. But more importantly, the females connect to female victims, but more importantly, the male police officer learning, training about victims and re-victimization when you might ask a question to a victim that you may not see offensive because the policeman has to get to the facts, but you have to be sensitive how you ask those questions and when you ask those questions.
Great, thank you very much. And would you have any suggestions for the legislators or policymakers?
I would mandate training, some type of training. We already have training, so make sure you understand that. But I think training that goes into those colleges and universities, and I think it'd be, for me, mandatory for students to go through that, because when you talk to freshmen, sophomores in college, it's a total different world because they're being released upon their college, most of them, with no more mom and no more dad, into another environment where the culture is so much different from where they were for 18 years. And I can tell you that because I have 3 sons that have gone through that too, still in college. They walk into any college, I don't care where it is in America, where the culture changes, where they're no longer having mom and dad on them every minute, every day. So I think the college and universities certainly have to take that responsibility on, if that means hiring somebody. The schools I've dealt with, that I've spoken to, they have unbelievable advocates in the school constantly messaging them. And they also have groups of survivors and former survivors that talk to the students And I think a victim speaking to a school is so much more powerful than someone that looks like me. In uniform, some of them will just black it out, it's the police talking to us, but bringing a victim in front of them, either human trafficking, someone's a victim of sexual assault, or drunk driving victim, when they walk in and they talk to an 18 to 22-year-old person, it has much more impact.
You're right. Any further questions for the Colonel? I want to thank you very much. And I'm going to ask for our next presenter to please come forward, and that is Stacey Veroni from the Attorney General's office. Thank you, Ms. Veroni. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. I did bring reinforcements. I brought with me Detective Sergeant Phil Hartnett from the Providence Police Department as well, and I felt that he would be useful to you for any questions. Providence investigates probably the most sexual assaults in the state and college campuses, and if you'd like that city perspective as well, I'm sure that he could give you some good information. So I want to start off, I guess, where the Colonel left off, as far as some of the training that has been done, or as one of the suggestions as far as training those who are in law enforcement to deal with victims of sexual assault. I serve the Attorney General and have been a member of that department for the past 21 years. I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with Peg Langhammer and Day One and many of the other individuals on the commission. And we are currently working together in other forums as well to put together an educational piece for victims of sexual assault. And I feel that in addition to, educating and speaking with potential offenders and speaking with those who investigate college campus sexual assaults with respect to sensitivity, we should be educating our students. And long before we're asking them to make very difficult decisions the night that a sexual assault happens, when there's someone from the school that's there telling them what the next steps are, when a police officer shows up to take a statement, that victim, male or female, college campus or non-college campus, really needs to know, where they're going and what the process is. And to ask a victim who all too often on a college campus will potentially be intoxicated or have some alcohol in their system, we're starting 2 steps back. And we all have to be on the same page as far as the information that we're providing to that victim. I have had many instances where victims have come forward, cases have been charged by the police department, and those victims have such great expectations for that case, that the defendant is going to be held, that there's not going to be a trial and they're going to accept responsibility, that this will be a short process. And what I'm here to talk about today, in addition to offering that suggestion, the educational piece for victims and all students really, is to talk a little bit about the process, which is frustrating to many, our victims who are involved, investigators, prosecutors, maybe defense attorneys and defendants alike. But it's a long process when a victim embarks upon a sexual assault complaint. So I want to share with you a couple of the whys that is, and also share with you some of the great expectations that we have for victims in charged cases when they come forward. And great expectations as soon as the case gets off the ground, almost immediately, within 10 days of one of the most violent and violative things that could have happened to that particular victim. When a case is brought in the criminal justice system, whether it's Providence or any of the other agencies, if it's a first-degree sexual assault, one of 2 things can happen when that defendant is brought in at arraignment. The defendant is released on bail. If it's a first-degree sexual assault, likely the police departments are going to ask that the offender be held without bail. And that really starts the clock ticking in our cases. If an offender is held without bail, in 10 business days, so 2 weeks, we are obligated to produce that victim if we want the defendant to continue to be held without bail at a bail hearing. where that victim will have to take the stand, and, not a year down the road when maybe that victim, he or she, is in counseling, not when they've had an opportunity to seek medical treatment and heal, but we're asking them, because we are required to by law in the Constitution, to begin to answer questions, subject themselves to cross-examination, and I can tell you so many times that those cases have really stopped there because that victim hadn't been in a position and maybe had not been, and perhaps most of the time, had not really been informed as to the expectations, what was going to be asked of him or her at that point in time. So we start along this criminal justice process just 10 days after an offender in a first-degree sexual assault case is charged. And sometimes that's too soon for that victim. And we have to work collaboratively to make that determination really upfront within that first 2 weeks. The case doesn't move quickly from there. And I can tell you that if it's a first-degree case, a capital offense, that case will have to be charged within 6 months. An indictment has to be returned, where that victim will likely again have to testify before a grand jury. And then the matter will eventually make it to a calendar in the Superior Court, where a process starts, a process of discovery, which can be very intrusive with respect to that victim. Counseling records are subpoenaed, telephone records and text messaging records are subpoenaed, and really the victim, at that point in time, if they haven't been educated about the process, really kind of will oftentimes throw their hands up and say, I want it to stop at that point. And we're really looking at, from the criminal justice perspective, not sooner than a year and more likely in the 2-year range before that case goes to trial. And the realities of that are when you're charging someone with a capital offense, defendants' attorneys want to exhaust all possibilities of discovery. That might include school records, as I mentioned already, counseling records, and it's a slow process. So we have to work, I suggest, really together as a team if the case is going to be brought to law enforcement to give that victim what they need. And I'm not saying, look, I don't want to scare a victim away by saying, okay, let's throw it on them all that night, but if they had that information prior to beginning the process, it's an expectation that everyone else is going through it, that it's not something that's just particular and personal to their particular case, but they'll be asking questions from there, from a point of knowledge, and I think that that's really and crucially important. As I mentioned, I've worked with Day One, and we're working together to put really a lot of that information together for victims, but that's if they use it, and that's if hopefully if the colleges will make that mandatory for students, both male and female students, whether or not it's a training session or the state police or Providence police are involved in coming in to kind of to let those expectations be known right away. We're in a very difficult position, we as well as the victims, and more important, the victims, when they come in and they have these expectations about a particular case and how it's supposed to go because people have misinformed them or haven't provided them with enough information. I do want to say a couple of other things about the prosecution of cases. First and foremost, whether a case is prosecuted, in the long run, we'd like to have that accountability for offenders, but the most important thing is that victim's safety, their personal safety, and their emotional security at that point in time. And we want to make sure that every victim knows that we're coming from that point in that perspective. And we understand that some victims won't be prepared to, go forward initially, but I do want to kind of give you some information as far as maybe like a caution as we go forward, because I've seen so many of these cases throughout the years. Delay in reporting, as the Colonel had mentioned, it leads to gaps in evidence. If we want accountability for offenders at some point in time down the road where we have a sexual assault, there is the potential to have DNA, biological materials deposited on clothing, detected in the rape kit, and it's so crucial that the victim comes forward, regardless of whether or not there's a prosecution in the case, for their own personal health and security, to go to the hospital and have that rape kit done. Selfishly, from a prosecutor's perspective, if there is a case, it will build a stronger case in the future. From the perspective of the victim, or thinking solely of the victim, make him or her safe. They can treat that victim with the medication that that victim needs immediately. No reason to wait. From the forensic standpoint, we will lose date rape drugs in the system after a certain period of time. The case, as you know, on college campuses will come down to a consent case. Was the victim flirting with the defendant? Was it really consent? There will likely be alcohol in the system. We have to deal with that as prosecutors. I want to know. I want to know the level of intoxication, and I want to know if there are date rape drugs in that victim system. It's very important from both of those perspectives, personal and prosecution perspective. Multiple statements, and this seems to be something that we've talked about, as a group so many times in the past. We need, as the Colonel said, our police departments to be educated and our campus security to be educated. When a case gets to the prosecutor's office, if it ever does, it's not unusual if the case has been investigated by campus security and then a state police department or local police department to already have 3-4 statements of the victim and the witnesses in the case. It makes it difficult, especially if you don't have individuals who are trained investigators, people who have worked as detectives on cases previously, maybe insensitive, but not knowing the correct questions to ask at that point in time. Not properly documenting something will create gaps in the case, and most important, it causes so much distress and discomfort for that victim because he or she is going to be on the stand and cross-examined so much longer due to the fact that there are multiple statements. So we really have to kind of work together to inform that victim and help that victim come to a decision as to whether or not the police will be involved. And I think that will help cut down on the multiple statements that a victim will give. And I understand, with respect to the colleges and universities, they have to do some of their own investigation and take statements. But the victim needs to understand as well that's not going to be the end of it for law enforcement. We'll need to ask other questions. Maybe something's missed, but most importantly, we need those statements from the colleges and universities. It becomes more discovery. It becomes more potentially leads to other witnesses being discovered so that we can investigate them, but it also can lead to inconsistencies and discrepancies between the statements that will be used to cross-examine. Obviously, when we're dealing with college campuses, and I've mentioned the self-ingestion of drugs or alcohol is oftentimes an issue, but we need to know about it so that we can address it at the beginning of the case to determine its viability or strength. I guess one of the most important things that I want to stress here is that we are all working together as a team, law enforcement, college campuses, victim services. Let's continue to work from this point forward to keep in mind all of the disciplines, the victim safety plan for the colleges, the victim's health plan from the medical perspective, and the prosecution or police investigative standpoint from that very beginning. Victims need to understand that time is our enemy in these cases, and we have delayed reporting cases. We're giving offenders opportunities to destroy valuable evidence. We're losing biological evidence or materials, and we're losing witness interests. Perhaps you've got people who were less inclined to side or take sides on the day that this event happened, this crime happened. But as time passes and rumors are out there flying about the college campus, it makes it more difficult for witnesses to come forward. And those are the things that I just wanted to share with you. It's a long process. It's not a pleasant process, for victims, but we have to work together to make it tolerable, to make it sensitive for them. As a prosecutor, my job is to do justice. It's not just to go forward with every single case that's there because a victim reports it and says that that's what happened. We have to test the evidence along the way with the aid of police departments like Providence and the state police. Victims can get frustrated about that. Why hasn't there been an arrest in my case? I don't know how many times you've all heard that, and that phone call then comes to me. My responsibility is to do justice, to make sure a case is charged on probable cause, to make sure that the investigation is moving forward, and we go from there. We assess each case based on the strengths of it at the time that it comes through the doors, and we continue to do so after when we gather valuable information. So I wanted to give you a little perspective on how long it takes a case to go through the system, some of the frustrating aspects when it comes to trying to obtain accountability, and the need for all of us to keep working together. And that educational component, long before the victim is in that situation that night, is just so crucial to their being able to come forward, to their going to the hospital, to their healing and moving on. And we want to continue to be part of that dialogue and to continue to be part of that process. And I'd ask Phil if he has anything to add to come forward, if you would like.
Or we can ask you to come next month when we will be hearing from municipal law enforcement. We would love to have you come and testify at that time, if you could.
We'll bring him back.
Yes, that would be great. So given the process, it sounds like it could be somewhat intimidating and everything so time sensitive. It might be overwhelming for a victim to come forward. How would you encourage them to still report, knowing that they'd have to go through this very lengthy process?
I think that one of the things that they need to know, so when we have victims that come in, they have expectations. And those expectations aren't the reality. The reality is that we do have people that are available from day one, someone that will come with them to court. We have a liaison with our department from our victim services team that can kind of bring them through the process. I want them to really have an idea of what that process looks like before they get involved in it. Before they, when they're coming to court for the first time and they have this expectation, well, I'm going to be heard by the judge and the defendant's going to be held. Well, no, the system is there designed to protect the rights of the accused. There's cross-examination, and a victim has to be prepared for that. So as intimidating as it is for anyone, in a criminal justice system is tough to navigate for anyone, but especially for a victim of sexual assault. But she or he, needs to know that, that that's part of the process, that as personal as it may be, they're not hearing that the first time when the detective drops a subpoena on them 3 days after they've left the hospital and the bail hearing's taken place, because they're saying, what do you mean, what bail hearing? And I'm going to have to testify? This wasn't explained to me. So if we can get to our victims, long before they're in that situation, to explain that there is help and there are resources for them there, I think that it's a different expectation they'll have at that point in time, and they'll know that there's somebody there, for them to literally handhold, but also to guide them through from a legal perspective the system. So it's a sensitive system, but if you go in there not having expected to have a bail hearing, not expecting to be cross-examined, I think that there's that natural reaction for a victim to really be on the defensive, not only with the defense attorney, but with the prosecutor, someone who's really on the same, for lack of a better term, team at this point in time. The prosecutor who has read their case, made a determination that we feel that it has enough to go forward at this point in time, and there's resistance right there from the get-go. We do our best to try to reach out to victims as soon as we know that that case comes in and it's being charged. We may not have that package for 7 days into the process because it hasn't been brought by the police department at that point in time. But if they've already had an opportunity to meet with someone from day one, they've already been explained by the college they've had it explained to them by the college long before they're sitting in that room that night crying and telling, what had happened to them. They already have this in their mind. They've heard this. It's not something that's so foreign to them. So I think that might make despite the fact that we do our best to make it a process, but it's not a friendly process, and it is an intimidating process. But there are resources, and we can hook our victims into those resources, and so can directly the college services and our police who are on scene immediately that night.
Thank you very much. Do any of the commission members have any questions? Yes, Ms. Johnson?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Stacy, you took the words right out of my mouth when you said hand-holding, because when I was going through the process, the Attorney General's office did hold my hand, as did Day One, and I can't tell you how helpful it was to me. I'm so indebted to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Veroni. We will be hearing from Providence College next. Dr. James Campbell, Title IX Coordinator and Assistant Vice President for Student Development, and Gail Dyer, Associate General Counsel. Welcome.
Madam Chairperson and members of the Commission, we want to thank you for the opportunity to share some information with you. We may have anticipated your invitation, Madam Chairperson, in terms of coming up with some recommendations. We've put our heads together and come up with a few to share with you later. I'm pleased to be here today with Gail Dyer from our Office of General Counsel. Gail's been a leader not only on Providence College campus but around the state regarding issues of sexual assault and Title IX. And it's been a privilege working with her, and I invite her to begin our testimony here today.
Good afternoon. I want to start by just highlighting for you just a few of our Title IX initiatives and resources on campus. Several years ago, we established a task force on campus. And the charge of the task force was to recommend ways to strengthen and supplement the college's systems for preventing and addressing all forms of sexual misconduct, of course, including dating and domestic violence and stalking. We had students, faculty, and staff, 22 members in total, work in 4 different subcommittees. And we put forth an extensive list of recommendations back in March of 2014. Many of these recommendations have already been implemented, and others are in various stages of implementation. Currently, we have a large group of really energized students, faculty, and staff on campus committed to working with our Title IX team to ensure the coordinated and effective improvements in all areas, to keep the conversations alive and relevant on campus, and to promote forward thinking. We have enhanced our victim resources. We have an MOU with Day One. We work with our ROTC on campus. We've also engaged in a number of conversations on campus and efforts to increase awareness and education. We have workshops and meetings with various groups. We've invited guest speakers. We have a website that has been critically acclaimed. We're proud of that by our students. They think it's a really neat website. We conducted a climate survey last spring of all undergraduate students. And we've posted stickers in all of the restroom stalls around campus. And included in your packet of handouts is a copy of our stickers. We have also implemented a very extensive step-up bystander intervention program. 96% of our students have participated in this initiative. And Dr. Campbell was a major leader of that effort and really led the programming in that effort. And he also engaged and recruited a number of students to work with him in presenting those step-up bystander intervention programs, which studies across the country have shown are extremely effective. With respect to policy development and amendments, we have considered, developed our policies and made amendments in light of both federal legislation, certainly, and federal guidance, in consultation with experts and our colleagues, and based on the lessons learned, the cases that we've handled and in our attempt to improve, based on debriefings and such after cases are resolved, we've made certainly amendments to our policies and procedures as well. We've adopted and disseminated a mandatory reporting policy that's effective for all responsible employees on campus, so all of our staff and faculty, with a very limited exception, and those exceptions are outlined in your packet of handouts in a flow chart. are mandatory reporters, and they're aware of their duties and responsibilities. The handouts are included in a folder that has been distributed to all faculty and staff, and it outlines, it references the mandatory reporting policy, and it provides some key definitions, resources on campus, and some tips for how to talk to students who may come to them to disclose some problematic behavior that they've been involved in or that they're even aware of. Next slide. We also want to briefly highlight for you some of our key Title IX procedures. These investigations, as everyone is aware, take extraordinary amounts of time and expertise. So we have now an outside investigator who works jointly with trained members of our Office of Safety and Security. And that process is working really well right now. If you refer to the flow chart in our handout, one thing you'll note is that the Title IX coordinator or the deputy coordinator assigned to the case is the one constant official who maintains contact with the parties during each stage of the process. And that's really crucial that the parties, both the complainant and respondent, know that if they have any questions or issues arise, that they can be in contact with that one person who oversees the process and the case. Also in your handouts, you'll see a sheet titled Student Rights. And these rights, just to highlight some of the key rights that are extended to all students involved in this process, those crucial rights are related to confidentiality, no retaliation, choosing an advisor, and the right to be treated with dignity and respect during the entire process. We've made some recent changes to our grievance resolution processes that we'd like to highlight for you. These include minimizing the number of persons to whom and the number of times complainants have to recount their experiences, providing opportunities for students to listen to and ask questions of the law enforcement advocate at the early stages of the process, the LEA, and also conducting the hearing in a manner that minimizes trauma to both parties and is less adversarial than it had been in the past.
Colonel O'Donnell mentioned earlier regarding the statistic around 1 in 5 reported sexual assaults on college campuses. It's a daunting, frightening number. It seemed like it bared repeating. About 11% of college women report a sexual assault that would probably in Rhode Island involve, first-degree sexual assault involving penetration, the most serious kind. 80 to 90% of campus sexual assaults are by acquaintances of the victim. And it's worth noting that this actually makes the impact of that more serious. Some people think this is counterintuitive of, some stranger jumping out of the bushes versus an acquaintance or a friend. When the offender is a friend, the degree of violation is worse. And the degree of self-doubt that it triggers is worse because an individual might, I trusted this person and they hurt me. I don't know who I can trust. Maybe I can't trust anyone. And it can trigger withdrawal and isolation and other kinds of psychological difficulties. As also noted, most victims don't report an assault. I think we need to continue to do research on what that's about. We know it has to do with several things, including self-doubt, minimizing about what happened. It also has to do with, facing the daunting process of filing a complaint or criminal justice system. It also has to do with fear of consequences, not only by an offender, but also by peers. Will I be believed? It's not only, the stereotype of, the gruff police officer. It can be friends. It can be professors that, example of one case, not at Providence College from some years ago, where a woman shared with a grad student shared with her advisor about a sexual assault, and he was very, very supportive and sympathetic and understanding, and we can do this for you, and anything she needed. And then she identified who the perpetrator was and someone else in the department. And then the response was, "Oh, are you sure? He's such a nice guy. He must have been some misunderstanding." And so right away it goes from support to a violation, to a disbelief, to hurt. And it's not a bad guy, it's not a bad person, but a misunderstanding of the process and a false belief that we can all somehow recognize perpetrators by looking at them. And so there's lots of dangers for survivors in this process. As a psychologist in the Title IX role, I'm a bit of a loner. I talk to and work with a lot of lawyers, and I've enjoyed that. But I'm a psychologist, and I look at it this a little bit differently, and it seemed like it'd be worth mentioning some of the psychological consequences that some of our survivors who testified at the beginning of this commission share. The shock, the self-blame, the shame. This interferes with, obviously, the reporting process. Sexual assault by acquaintance, as I mentioned, can make the impact worse. Increased risk of depression, sexual medical problems, important. Even if they're not bringing a complaint, that survivors get medical and mental health follow-up. Withdrawal, mood, anxiety problems. For a student, these things like concentration, sleep problems really interfere with their success, their ability to work, and therefore feeling I'm being punished now because I'm getting bad grades, and what did I do? So the secondary victimization process, again, that Colonel O'Donnell mentioned, the disbelief by others, overwhelming criminal. I have colleagues, psychologists, who feel terrified of testifying. I can't imagine what it's like for an 18-year-old young woman who's just been violated in this way. It's just overwhelming. So, good.
So since we're the last college to testify, we thought, Jim and I, that we would just to discuss with the Commission some recommendations from our perspective. We believe that based on conversations and interactions with colleagues over the years, that our colleagues at other schools would support these recommendations as well. And some of them have already been addressed with the testimony you've heard or at least mentioned. So for us, it seems that the big picture question is, what are the most significant challenges to making students safer and holding offenders accountable? We certainly don't profess to have all the answers, but we think it can be helpful if we objectively assess what we know in terms of understanding the complex barriers to achieving those goals. So we need to be aware of the barriers to reporting. Let's be clear, most students do report. They just don't report officially. Rather, they tell a friend, they tell a roommate, maybe even a family member. We understand why. This crime is certainly different from other crimes, and there's lots of research as to why that is. Ultimately, wouldn't persons in the critical age range of 18 to 24, including college students, be safer if there were cultural shifts in terms of how we think and talk about this issue? So one of our recommendations is that we need to improve the response to victims by assuring that investigators on campuses and within law enforcement receive extensive and ongoing training. As Colonel O'Donnell has noted, the training certainly needs to be trauma-informed. It should include information about the complexity of these types of cases. It should be standardized across campuses and departments, police departments and prosecutors, and it should be in-depth. It should involve not only the receipt of information, but also the examination of case studies, and we believe role-playing. We need to practice. To be a really good, keen investigator, you need to do it for a while. And the parties need skilled investigators who are non-judgmental. Next, we believe that, or we would recommend that the process needs to be more under the control of the victim to maximize the victim's choices. And this may help reduce the delays that Stacy addressed in the formal reporting process. We also would recommend that we need to begin to think about ways to expedite the criminal justice process that Stacy has outlined as being somewhat cumbersome. And are there ways? And back, many years ago, we found ways to expedite the processes for children. We really did. We made some great strides back in the 80s and 90s in changing the way young children get process who are victims of sexual assault get dealt with by the system, so to speak. And so we need to really focus on this for adults as well. Plus, we need to realize that with respect to college students, it's a unique scenario. It's certainly possible and likely that by the time the case gets to grand jury or trial, the student may not be in Rhode Island anymore, maybe living thousands of miles away. And that adds its own, some extra elements of complexity to a case.
Although the focus of this commission is sexual assault on college campuses, I need to acknowledge I've spent some years in community psychology and would like the legislature at large to be keeping in mind victims who are not college students, who have pretty ready access to counseling centers and student health centers and so forth, that the needs there are also pretty great. And it's hard to get good data on how that compares, but Department of Justice, in one assessment found that women in particular who are not students are more likely, somewhat more likely to be victimized. But it's at least as great. One of the few interventions we've been able to identify that really seems to make a difference is bystander training. Many of the campuses that have testified are implementing that, thankfully. Continue to explore how that is going to make a difference. In some surveys, half of the students reported that they had observed someone who was drunk heading off for what looked like a sexual encounter, and almost none of them intervened in any way. So bystander training helps people figure out how can I intervene safely. We're not looking for people to put themselves in danger, but to call someone, get help, distract, all kinds of interventions that can make a difference in those situations. We'd also talk about changing the climate. Continue to work on changing the climate in general. Sort of the broken window theory. Change how people think about relationships and objectification of individuals, dealing with things at a lower level, gender bias, discrimination, harassment, in all areas of life. And also expand access to education about these things. Students tell us they want to talk about these things. They don't particularly want to be lectured about them, but they want to be engaged in relationships regarding sexuality and relationships, and they actually love those talks. And we need to figure out how to get better at helping them with that. The CDC has come up with some interesting assessments that invites us to look upstream at prevention. They've identified some evidence-based interventions that work with middle school and high school students that seem down the road to have a positive impact on sexual assault, and to learn more about those kinds of things and how that could be integrated in our school systems. It's really about, what do we do at three levels? Prevention, education, care and support for survivors who must not be forgotten in the midst of all our look at policy, and also how to, make the whole complaint system on college campuses and the criminal justice system less daunting for survivors. We thank you for hearing us.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Ms. Dyer, does the commission have any questions? I want to, Colonel O'Donnell.
So I just have one note for either. Could you just walk us through, I would say typical, but a complaint of a sexual assault on Providence College campus? What happens from the victim? Where does it go? And how far you take it internally before it goes out?
Sure. Some of it depends on who they report to. There's confidential sources. If the student, say, comes to a chaplain or a counselor in the counseling center and shares they've been assaulted and they don't want to do anything else about it, then it stays there until that individual changes their mind. If they would like some support around a complaint with the college, then a different set of things happen, and they are fairly extensive. They are offered opportunities to first go to the hospital, to support them if they wish to talk to the police, and we also have them meet with a Title IX coordinator who explains the process for them, and then the process is followed up with an investigation on campus. We contract with an outside investigator who's trained in this area and also independent. We want to make sure this process feels really transparent, independent to survivors, and there's lots of variations. Is the reported respondent, which is what we call the person who's accused, is that a student, is a Providence College student, or a student at some other college? Is it a staff or faculty? Is it so we consider all those kinds of things. But if it's another student, then that student is also provided with the Title IX intake and explain the process, explain their rights, and the investigation proceeds. And as most of you know, we're required to do our best to wrap up those investigations within 2 months. Very different what happens in the criminal system, which can go on for a long time. Depending on what our student conduct system decides, either the respondent or the complainant can appeal, which is also different from the public criminal justice system. And then that appeal is then considered by appropriate officer, usually the vice president. So that's a very brief walkthrough. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or if, does that answer your question sufficiently? We invite and even encourage, we try not to pressure, but we strongly encourage at the very beginning students to report to the police. Absolutely. We take that very seriously. We don't pressure them if they choose not to, but we encourage them, we assure them, we will support them in process, we will go with them. We could ask our director of safety security if they're more secure, see if police will come to the campus. We'll try to do whatever we can to make that process less daunting for them, and also connect them with an advocate on campus who's very familiar with the criminal justice system to help walk them through that, so it makes it more predictable and understandable. But we're very conscious of the need to have police involvement if the survivor is willing.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I want to thank you very much for coming. I think some of those recommendations are worth looking at, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay. There's no more questions, correct? Okay, I'd like to take a moment before we adjourn today to congratulate one of our colleagues, Claire Hall, who has been chosen to work with the National Center for Public Safety. She is one of only 25 chosen to participate in this program, and I hope you'll all join me in congratulating her. Our next meeting will be February 29th, and we will be hearing from municipal law enforcement departments. I want to thank you all for coming. I'd like a motion for adjournment. So moved. Thank you very much.